Welcome to Inside the Issues. I'm Alex Cohen. I'm coming to you from my home here in Northeast Los Angeles. A home that is probably worth an average of $70,000 more than a home of the same size, with the same quality school system and the same access to parks and other amenities, but located in a predominantly African American neighborhood. That is just one example of how systemic racism affects California's housing crisis. It's a topic that our first guest tonight has written about extensively. Matt Levin is a reporter with CalMatters and co-host of the podcast Gimme Shelter. Matt, it's great to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So those numbers there, I want to say it's on average because I live in a neighborhood here in Southern California that is pretty diverse. But you wrote about this, how when they say location, 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 really what you're talking about is race, race, race. Explain.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's a conversation that, especially here in California, a lot of people might be uncomfortable having because we consider ourselves we pride ourselves for the most part on being a progressive, diverse, inclusive place. But as you mentioned, a house with the same amenities, the same size, in similar neighborhoods, with the only difference being one is in a majority Black neighborhood, the other is in a neighborhood with very few Black people. You see significant difference in the value of those homes. So you mentioned the numbers for Los Angeles. It's even a starker disparity in the Bay Area, where Black-owned homes on average are about over $100,000 devalued compared to homes in places where there aren't that many Black people. So you see that the effects of discriminatory policies of the past, as well as some of the implicit biases I think people have in where they want to live, are still pretty rampant here in California.
And it's like many of the issues involving systemic racism. Of course, it doesn't just happen here in California. This is something that is seen reflected throughout the country. But you've actually looked into this, and you can give us a sense of how the disparities in housing here compare with other states. What can you tell us about that?
So I think the most important thing to know is that Black Californians, as opposed to Black residents of other states, have a higher cost burden in terms of how much they pay for rent and mortgages, which is kind of intuitive, right? California is a very expensive place to live. So you would expect that, overall Californians tend to be pretty highly burdened by rents and mortgages. So Black Californians would kind of suffer that as well. So the scale of it here, I think, is eye-opening, right? So overall, about 40% of Californians pay more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. But for Black Californians, that number is 50%, so over half. And about 25% of Black California households pay over 50% of their income in housing costs, which makes it really difficult to save enough to buy a home or to weather maybe an unexpected job loss or another hit to your income.
And of course, there is a long history that has brought us to this moment, and it's a really important history. So if viewers there aren't familiar with it, look up redlining, find out what has happened in the past. But Matt, I'd like you to kind of look at this present moment and into the future a bit, because now here we are in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. We have seen a lot of people unable to pay their rent or greatly concerned about it. What do you see as a potential future here when it comes to these disparities in the housing crisis as it pertains to Black Californians?
So I think researchers in this space are especially concerned that we might see a repeat of what happened with the Great Recession, which disproportionately kind of decimated Black home ownership. So, 2006, 2007, Black home ownership nationally and in California actually reached an all-time peak. And people were feeling pretty positive about that development. And then the foreclosure crisis hit. There was lots of predatory lending that specifically targeted Black and brown households, and Black homeownership fell precipitously. Black homeownership has not recovered either in California or nationally basically since then. So, this recession looks different than what happened in 2008, 2009. It's not, specifically centered in the housing market per se, but there still is a broad worry that it could disproportionately impact Black Californians that were already struggling post Great Recession. One of the most stark disparities I found was the levels of wealth that Black households have in the Los Angeles area versus other ethnic groups. So the median net worth of a Black household in greater Los Angeles is only about $4,000. You compare that to white households where it's well over $300,000, or Asian American households where it's over $400,000, and you begin to see how stark these disparities really are.
And Matt, I want to pivot for a moment and talk about some of the other great reporting that you've been doing, talking about what has been happening right now for those in California experiencing homelessness. Gavin Newsom has made this big push and put a lot of money towards this Project ROOMKEY program, which converts hotels and motels into shelters for those without a home. And I've just been fascinated by this because, right, hotels and motels, that is a whole business and industry and system of its own. It does not seem like you could just flip a switch and suddenly make those homes for folks. What does it take to pull that off?
It takes money. It takes a good deal of money and time. And the state does not have a ton of either of those, right? So I did a story basically looking at, okay, this is Gavin Newsom's plan. He's doubling down on this. The pillar of his homelessness strategy now is we're going to take all of these motels that we use for temporary housing to shield the homeless during the pandemic. We're going to buy as many as we can and transition them into something more permanent. These types of motel conversions have been done before, and they're kind of expensive. An Econo Lodge that was converted to permanent supportive housing in Anaheim, and not a, especially higher income part of Anaheim, but more kind of on the outskirts, a lower middle income area of Anaheim. It costs about $360,000 per unit to transform it from a motel room into more permanent supportive housing. So you're right. You can't just flip a switch. And I think a lot of Californians, this does seem like a very intuitive solution, right? We got these motel rooms, nobody's in them. People want to exit the industry. Why don't we just take everybody who's living on the street and put them inside? But it's not that simple.
No, and you write about the fact that, right now is a good moment potentially to buy up some of these properties because not a whole lot of tourism happening. There are hotel and motel owners who are looking to sell, but they're still not cheap. And if you do get the cheap ones, that's usually because they have a lot of work to do. So this might be part of the solution. Clearly, this cannot be the entire solution. And one of the other things that's going on right now that I know you've been looking at, Matt, is the state budget. And of course, at the beginning of this year, it's crazy. It feels like a million years ago. Governor Newsom's state of the state was really the state of our housing crisis and homelessness. And there were all these lofty plans. Now that we are approaching July 1st, what are things actually looking like when it comes to how much money can be committed to housing and homelessness?
So compared to other parts of the budget that were either cut or had some kind of budget gimmicks put in place because of a estimated $54 billion deficit that the state is confronting, homelessness programs actually fared pretty decently. And that's partly a reflection of Newsom prioritizing this earlier in the year, and partly a reflection of some flexibility that they could use federal money to spend on specific programs. So going back to January, Newsom had proposed $750 million. This was before the pandemic hit and ruined the state budget for new homelessness spending. He is replacing that now with $500 million in federal money to buy all of these hotels and motels. There's an additional $300 million that legislators successfully negotiated into the budget that is just kind of general homelessness aid. I think overall, the big picture takeaway here is homelessness funding, considering the dire straits that the budget is in, fared pretty decently, and advocates are relatively happy with how it's shaped out.
Matt Levin, you can find more on his reporting at calmatters.org. And don't forget, you can join us here each Wednesday on Inside the Issues for more on the great journalism the Cal Matters team does covering the Golden State. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you, Alex.